Racist tourist punches Black Royal Guard, but what happens next is shocking. As the Royal Guard stood still in their formal order outside of Buckingham Palace, the sun shone off their shiny helmets. There were a lot of tourists around the gates, and their voices mixed together to make a noise of wonder and excitement. There was an American middle-aged man named Harold Mason in the crowd. He was loud and felt even more entitled than others. Harold, who was wearing an annoyingly bright Hawaiian shirt, didn't try to hide how much he didn't like the show. "What is this foolishness?" The noise Harold made was loud enough for people close to hear. "A black guard working for the Queen? It's ridiculous." He looked closely at Marcus Williams, a young black guard whose calm face didn't show any signs of the anger that was boiling inside. Marcus was in the Royal Guard because his father had been a member for many years. He won his spot by working hard and following the rules for years. Even though Harold was making fun of him more and more, he did his job with quiet respect today as he did every day. "Hear me, kid?" Harold took a step toward the guard and scowled. "I bet you don't belong here." The people around him traded nervous looks, and some took out their phones to record what was happening. Marcus didn't move. His eyes were set straight ahead, a strong sign of discipline as he followed the strict rules of behavior required of royal guards. Harold wasn't done, though. "Pay attention to me when I talk," Harold yelled, and his angry face turned red. Because Marcus didn't answer, Harold got very angry. Harold's fist hit Marcus in the jaw with a quick, reckless swing, which made everyone in the crowd gasp. The world seemed to stop for a short time. Marcus stumbled a little, but he kept his cool. His training overrode his urge to fight back. There was a lot of stress in the air as Harold smiled and seemed proud of his attack. "What are you going to do now?" Harold laughed and stepped back with a cocky grin on his face. But before anyone could say anything else, a sharp, forceful voice rang out. "Get away from the guard!" A police officer in plain clothes came out of the crowd. His badge sparkled in the sun. Harold turned around, and his grin began to fade as he realized he had been caught. Even as things got worse, Marcus did not move. He kept his eyes straight ahead, but there was a storm brewing behind his calm appearance. It's possible that Harold Mason had no idea who he had hit or what was going to happen next. People in the crowd were talking quietly as the cop held Harold down. Every second was recorded on phones, so Harold's deeds and Marcus's control would soon be known to everyone. As Harold was taken away, his confidence went away and was replaced by a flicker of uneasiness. The thing he didn't know yet was that this was just the start. Some shocking and hidden facts were about to come out, and Harold's life was about to take a sudden and unchangeable turn. As people rushed for answers, the scene turned into chaos as their interest grew. Marcus, on the other hand, kept quiet. His calm attitude hid how bad the day had been. In his heart, he knew that justice was coming, but it would come in a way that Harold could never have imagined. The effects of Harold Mason's attack on Marcus Williams spread quickly. A large group of people had already formed by the time the officer in plain clothes led Harold to the gates of Buckingham Palace. His cocky grin was caught on camera as he waved away the officer's advice. Tourists whispered to each other, some of them angry and others shocked. There were already a lot of videos on social media, and the comments were getting worse and worse. But Harold, who didn't know any better, brushed it all off. He thought no one could hurt him because he had seen worse scandals go away. He mumbled, "Pathetic," and walked out into the street. "He's just a guard." "Who cares?" Marcus stayed at his post, his muscles tense from the rush of energy going through his body. Years of service had taught him strict discipline, which kept him steady, but the insult hurt. Even though the punch hurt less, being made fun of in front of everyone was still very painful. He could feel the weight of many eyes on him, both real ones and the ones on the cams that had caught it all. He didn't say anything, though. Because he was a royal guard, he didn't break, Harold muttered to himself as he slipped into the crowds of London's streets. His pride led him to the nearby pub. He wasn't scared by what happened at Buckingham Palace. If anything, it made him more sure that he was right. After all, who was this guard to not notice him or recognize him? Harold saw himself as the victim, and with each step, he felt more entitled. After hours, as London started to get darker, Harold came out of the pub, a little wobbly but still angry as ever. He told everyone who would listen about his argument with Marcus, but he changed the details to make it look like he was a brave truth-teller standing up to what he saw as failure. Some people in the crowd laughed nervously because they didn't know how to react to his racism. Harold felt stronger because they were quiet, so he stumbled back into the night. The city had changed since he walked into the bar, though. Videos of the attack were going viral, and people were getting more and more angry. Harold's face, twisted into a sneer, was shown on TVs all over the world, and his name was being used with hashtags that called for responsibility. The picture of Marcus, who was calm and polite in the face of Harold's violence, made a lot of people back the royal guard and speak out against Harold's actions. Harold went back to Buckingham Palace for some reason, even though he didn't know that a storm was coming his way. He might have been drunk, or he might have had a strange sense of unfinished business. He wasn't sure why, but he had to talk to Marcus again, to put the guard in his place. When he got close to the castle gates, which were now empty except for the guards who were standing at their places, there was a silence. Harold stopped and felt less sure of himself when he saw Marcus standing where he had been hours before. The air felt denser, and the shadows were darker. Harold couldn't put his finger on why the guard's constant presence in the growing darkness made him feel uneasy. "What's wrong? Are you still too scared to speak?" Harold yelled, and the empty square echoed with his voice. "Do you think you're better than I am? You're not worth anything." Marcus wasn't moving. It didn't bother him. Harold was drunk, so his silence, which was stronger than any words, cut through the fog and left him feeling afraid and exposed. But before Harold could say anything else, there was a low, authoritative voice that broke the quiet. It sent a chill down Harold's spine. "Sir, get away from the gates right away." Harold turned around and saw a tall, intimidating person in a police outfit coming toward him. Unlike the cop in regular clothes from earlier, this man seemed very authoritative. His eyes were cold, and he didn't give in. Harold paused, and his confidence began to crumble. "What are you?" Harold ordered, trying to get back to being cocky like before. The police officer didn't answer. Instead, he made a sharp motion to the side, and 2 more guards came out of the darkness. Harold's heart started to beat fast. This wasn't just a normal lecture. Something much bigger was going on. The officer spoke with a steely voice. "You've already caused enough trouble for one day, and I promise you that we know everything." "Everything?" Harold's voice was shaking. "Yes," the cop said as he walked up nearby. "And believe me, you don't realize how bad your actions will be." As the guards closed in on Harold, his thoughts were racing. The officer's words hung in the air around him like a noose getting tighter. Harold began to understand for the first time how bad what he had done was. He was blinded by his pride, and now he stood on the edge of a fate he couldn't stop. Who is Marcus? He stood at his post and watched in silence. Not bragging or laughing, they were just observing as Harold's world started to fall apart. Harold Mason was sitting in his small hotel room, and the light from his laptop screen made his face look paler. As he looked through social media, his fingers were shaking. There was video of what happened at Buckingham Palace on every station. No matter what he did, his name was on the rise. The names like #Justice for Marcus, #Racist Tourist, and #Black Royal Guard were very mean. Thousands of strangers were analyzing his actions, and some were even looking into his past to find a pattern of similar angry behavior. The tapes showed more than just him punching someone. They also showed how professional Marcus was and how calm he stayed even as Harold got more angry. Harold's sneering face was frozen in a million pictures, a digital memorial to how ashamed he felt. Even though he slammed the laptop shut and cursed under his breath, the truth of the matter didn't change. It might have even seemed bigger. On the nightstand next to his bed, his phone kept buzzing and quivering with messages he was too scared to read. There was a number he didn't know among the missed calls and texts from friends and family, some giving support and others expressing shock. The attached message sent a chill down his spine. Asterisk, asterisk. "Mr. Mason, we need to talk about how you've been acting lately. Get in touch with us right away. Asterisk, asterisk. It wasn't signed, but it was clear that it was an important message. Harold's thoughts were going fast. Could it be the police, the palace, or even worse, someone with ties to Marcus? He had to move around. Harold paced the room and mumbled to himself as he tried to make sense of what was going on. He said out loud, "It's just internet drama." But the shake in his voice showed that he was scared. "It always goes away on its own." He knew this wasn't like before, though. The video made people feel something. One of the most famous places in the world was the scene of a disrespectful act that could not be ignored because the person was clearly drunk. Then there was Marcus. Harold thought again about the guard's steady, calm presence. All day, Marcus couldn't get rid of that steady, keen look in his eyes. Marcus hadn't said anything, but Harold thought the guard had said a lot. That stillness, that quiet, was louder than any reprimand. He was thinking when his phone rang. Another number I don't know. Harold answered even though he knew he shouldn't have. A voice that was cut off said, "Mr. Mason. My name is Claire Hayes, and I work for the Metropolitan Police. We need you to come in so we can ask you about what happened at Buckingham Palace." Harold felt sick to his stomach. He stutters, "Questioning," and holds the phone so tightly that his fingers turn white. "Why? I didn't do anything wrong." The officer responded, "Mr. Mason, assault is a crime," and her tone was firm. We also have reason to think there are things that make things worse. We think you should come on your own. Adding to the problem? How could you say that? Harold asked, but his voice was shaking. Hayes said in a cold voice, "You'll find out when you get here. You need to be at the station by 9 a.m. tomorrow. You will be given a warrant if you don't show up." Harold was shocked as the line went dead. He just stared at the phone. What's that? For him? He felt panicked when he realized he might be in more trouble than he thought. While this was going on, Marcus was sitting across from a top Royal Guard officer in a quiet room in Buckingham Palace. The weight of the talk making its way through the room was heavy. "We've found the person who attacked you," the officer said, his voice calm but worried. "Harold Mason, a citizen of the United States, here on a tourist visa." Marcus gave a quiet nod. Harold Mason was not interesting to him as a person. He cared about the concept and the message that his self-control had sent. The cop slid a file across the desk and said, "There's more. Mason has a past. Several things happened back in the U.S., including harassment, fights, and even a charge of attack that was later dropped. It looks like this isn't the first time he's done something wrong." Marcus looked over the papers with a frown on his face. From each record, it was clear that the man had lived his life without any consequences, getting by on his wealth and pride. Why hasn't he been punished before? His voice was calm but sharp as he asked. The cop just said, "Connections. But everyone is watching this time." As Marcus leaned back, the weight of the moment hit him. It wasn't just about Harold anymore. It was about holding someone responsible who had been avoiding it for too long, and maybe about sending a bigger message. After some thought, the cop said, "One more thing. The Home Office has asked us some questions. They are thinking about taking Mason's visa away, even though it doesn't happen often in this case." Marcus looked at her with wonder. "Do you really believe they'll follow through?" The police officer looked at him. "Yes, as long as the investigation finds enough ties." Harold sat alone in his room with a half-empty bottle of whiskey as the clock hit midnight. He hadn't touched it since the detective called, but the thought of it made him feel better in some strange way. What lay ahead of him weighed him down and made him feel like he could not breathe. Harold thought about Marcus again while he was drunk. That look, that awful look. It wasn't anger or rebellion. It was something worse. It was too bad. Harold Mason began to ask himself for the first time if he had done something wrong that he could never take back. Harold Mason walked slowly toward the Metropolitan Police Station in the cool morning air. He was filled with a poisonous mix of fear and anger. The streets of London, which looked so beautiful the day before, were now very crowded. He heard whispers, but no one spoke. He grabbed his coat even tighter, trying to block out the looks he thought other people were giving him. A scary brick building that looked more like a castle than a courthouse stood in front of them. It was the station. When Harold walked inside, Detective Claire Hayes looked at him with a cold stare. Her smart outfit and stern personality didn't leave any room for small talk. She said, "Mr. Mason?" But her voice was cut off. "This way." Harold went after her down a tight hallway where the walls got closer with each step. A single chair and a metal table were set up in a clean questioning room for him. Every move he made felt like it was being watched, but Hayes didn't say a word as she sat down across from him. Harold broke the stifling quiet with a scream. "I didn't do anything wrong." "People are making this much bigger than it is." Hayes didn't move. Then she carefully opened the file that she had put on the table. "Mr. Mason, the video of you hitting a Royal Guard is very bad evidence. You're here for more than one reason, though." Harold raised an eyebrow. "Do you mean to say that—" Hayes leaned forward and her eyes got narrow. "The U.S. government has contacted us. They told each other about your past, including several fights, harassment cases, and one case where a protection order was made against you. That was a trail you left, Mr. Mason. But this time you went in the wrong direction." Harold's heart was racing. He spoke up to say something, but Hayes cut him off. "In the past, you may have tried to avoid responsibility, but this is different. You hit a Royal Guard member in front of a lot of people, and many of them were recording. Marcus Williams, that guard, isn't just any guard." Harold stopped moving. That name was there again. Chris Williams. What made it carry so much weight? His discomfort grew. Hayes went on, "Marcus Williams is the son of a decorated Royal Guard. His dad, Gerald Williams, was famous all over the country. He was a model of strength and honor. When no one else would, he fought for his place in the Guard, making way for people like his son." Harold moved around in his seat, which was not comfortable, but Hayes kept going. "You didn't just attack a guard when you hit Marcus. You heard a whole history, which people around the world appreciate a lot more than you do. Marcus, on the other hand, was sitting in the same room at Buckingham Palace where he had heard about Harold's past. Captain Eldridge, who was his higher officer, stood across from him and looked very angry. "Something has changed," Eldridge said. "Harold Mason won't take responsibility." He is sticking to his story and saying he is a victim, and the public's anger is growing. Marcus put his hands in his lap and kept his cool. His jaw was tight, though. Why do they want me? Eldridge was unsure. The palace wants you to say something. It's time to talk about what happened and get back to the guard's honor. I'll understand if you say no, though. Marcus's eyes showed feeling for the first time. He had never said a word in his life, letting his deeds speak for themselves. But now that his father's memory and the public's interest were weighing on him, he knew that remaining quiet might not be enough. Marcus finally said in a calm voice, "I'll do it. But first I have to face him." Harold had been in the questioning room for hours, and his nerves were stressed when the door opened. He thought Hayes would come back, but Marcus Williams walked in with 2 cops on either side of him. Harold took a deep breath. Marcus was wearing his full formal outfit, and he made a strong impression. "You!" Harold yelled, his voice full of anger. "Ask yourself, why are you here?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He took off his hat and set it on the table before sitting down next to Harold. Harold was becoming more and more scared while he was staying cool. Marcus said in a steady, low, but strong voice, "I wanted to see the man who thought it was okay to hit me, to look him in the eye and ask him one thing." Harold wriggled as Marcus looked straight into his eyes. "What question?" "Why?" Marcus just asked. "Why did you think it was okay to do what you did?" Harold was weak. Marcus's calm personality broke through his bluster. He stuttered, You wouldn't even acknowledge me. You looked like you were better than me as you stood there." Marcus slightly tilted his head and looked at Harold. "That hurt your pride. That's what this was about, right?" Harold's face turned red. "It's not that easy. People like you," Marcus cut in with a sharp voice, "people like me." "Say it. What do you mean?" Harold stopped speaking because the words were getting stuck in his throat. There was an eerie silence after that. Marcus leaned forward and his voice got sharper. "You can no longer use excuses to get away with things. You hit me because you were sure you could, since you thought I wouldn't fight back. That person has thought that before, but you will be one of the last." Harold's bluster fell apart totally. He looked down because he couldn't meet Marcus's eyes. Detective Hayes walked in when the door opened again. She said in a soft voice, "That's enough, Mr. Williams." Marcus stood there, taller than Harold, for a moment before turning around to leave. Marcus stopped and looked back as he got to the door. "You will be found guilty, Mr. Mason. It does that every time." He then left, leaving Harold to deal with the implications he could no longer avoid. Harold Mason was sitting in the waiting room at the police station. He was very nervous, and no longer thought he was important. His thoughts were all over the last 2 days. The punch, the tapes, the reaction, and finally the fight with Marcus Williams. Harold didn't want to accept it, but Marcus's cool but direct words had hurt him deeply. He held on to the hope that this too would pass. It always had before. Detective Hayes walked in with the folder in his hand after the door opened. As she sat down across from Harold and put the folder on the table, her face was hard to read. She didn't say anything right away. Instead, she turned the pages inside. The stress in the room grew stronger. She began, "Mr. Mason," her voice sharper than before, "we're done with our investigation. You also need to know something that we confirmed with our friends in the U.S. Harold leaned forward and his hands felt cold. "Do you mean to say that?" When Hayes looked up, her sharp eyes held him still. "Marcus Williams isn't just a guard. He is part of a special group that deals with high-profile cases of foreign security. As a result of your temper tantrum, you hit a man whose links you have no idea how to understand." Harold took a deep breath. "Are there links?" "What do you mean?" The voice of Hayes got colder. "I'm saying that Marcus's job isn't just for show. He helps with security tactics that keep world leaders and guests like American officials safe. By hitting him, you not only broke the law, but you also insulted a powerful person with a lot of power in the world. In fact, we've been told that the U.S. State Department is very interested in what happened." Harold's face lost all of its color. The Department of State? Why would they care about this? When Hayes leaned forward, her voice almost became a whisper. Why? Because Gerald Williams, Marcus Williams's late father, saved the life of an American ambassador during a time of international trouble. That ambassador is now a high-level official in the U.S. government, and they don't like how Gerald Williams's son was treated badly by a man who has a history of violence and selfishness. Harold opened and closed his mouth, but he didn't say anything. What Hayes said hit him like a freight train with all its weight. "You've crossed a line that goes far beyond a video going viral or a public outrage," Hayes said in a harsh voice. "You've hurt a family with ties to both countries and a history that is much more important than your small grudges." Harold scratched his head and his voice shook. "I didn't know. I didn't mean to—" Hayes stopped him. "Mr. Mason, intent doesn't change the results. What this does will have effects that are bigger than you thought possible. When the door opened again, Harold was shocked to see Marcus Williams walk in. He was dressed normally, but he gave off the same air of quiet power that had scared him before. He stood tall, and the room felt his weight. Marcus kept his eyes on Harold as he looked at him directly. He spoke in a cool but strong voice. "You didn't just insult me. You made fun of everything my dad fought for and gave up to show that people like us have a place in the world." Harold stuttered, and his voice cracked as he said, I didn't know." "No," Marcus said in a harsher voice. "You didn't. Because people like you only think about how much better they are. But you need to know the truth. What you do has results, and those results are happening right now." Hayes gave Marcus a paper when Marcus turned to him. He took a quick look at it and then slid it across the table to Harold. Harold picked it up and started to read it with shaking hands. As he thought about what she said, his eyes got bigger. Marcus told them simply, "You're being sent away. Starts right away. Your visa has been revoked, and you will not be able to enter the UK for most likely." Harold was shocked. "Sent away? That's not possible. I have rights." Hayes put her arms together. "Mr. Mason, you've used up all of those rights. It was dangerous enough to attack a royal guard on its own. Because what you did has effects on people all over the world, this choice had to be made." Marcus moved closer, and his voice stayed the same. "You thought you could punch someone and get away with it. You'll have to deal with the results now, though. Your good name and the right to come here are both gone. You are the only one to blame." Harold's head sagged, and all of his confidence broke. Because of this, he finally knew how bad he had been. Not just to himself, but also to other people. Marcus stopped at the door and looked back as he turned to leave. "My dad taught me to always be bigger than small things. But being fair doesn't mean keeping quiet. Mason, don't forget that." Marcus closed the door behind him, leaving Harold to deal with the truth on his own. He got where he couldn't get back because he was too proud, and now he was finally paying the price. Harold Mason was in the back of a police transport truck. The consequences of what he had done were like a heavy load on his body. He didn't really notice as the London streets went by the windows. He felt ashamed, sorry, and shocked all at the same time. Harold was being held responsible in a way he couldn't get out of or change for the first time in his life. He was stripped of the armor of confidence he had worn, leaving him open to the hard truth of his decisions. After several hours, Harold was led to a flight that was going to the United States. No cheers or sympathy, just a cold, quiet trip back to the land where his pride had made him rich. While the plane was taking off, he looked out the window and realized that his old life was over. His name would follow him everywhere because it was now linked to shame. Marcus Williams stood at the gates of Buckingham Palace when he got back to work in London. He did so with the same respect and calmness that had shown throughout the experience. After the event, the air was cooler and there wasn't as much noise from tourists, but Marcus's presence didn't change. A little boy with his mother's hand came up to the gates. When he looked up at Marcus, his eyes sparkled, and love and awe were clear on his face. "Is that the guard who stood up to the bad guy?" the boy asked his mother in a loud whisper. He smiled at Marcus as his mother nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, that's his face." Marcus felt a small smile on his lips for the first time in days. He gave the boy a small, unobtrusive nod and then went back to his stiff position. At that moment he realized that his actions, his failure to get down on Harold's level and his lack of words had sent a much stronger message. In a different room, Captain Eldridge was reading the final report on the event while sitting at his desk. The study was over, and Harold Mason was legally sent back to his home country. Eldridge let out a sigh and leaned back in his chair as he thought about what he could learn from the experience. He looked at a picture on his desk. It was a black and white picture of Marcus's father, Gerald Williams, standing tall in his Royal Guard outfit many years ago. Gerald had to deal with racism and hard times, but he never gave up. His drive helped others, including his son, get ahead. Eldridge smiled as he picked up the picture. He said in a low voice, "You'd be proud of him, Gerald." Harold got off the plane in the United States and right into a world he didn't know. He came home to a media storm, and reporters swarmed the airport with their cameras flashing. He put his hand over his face to avoid answering their questions, but it was too late. The man who used to love being noticed now just wanted to hide. Harold tried to rebuild his life over the next few weeks, but his fame hung over him like a cloud. There were no more job offers or bonds, and every conversation was tinged with criticism. That was the first time Harold had no one but himself to blame, and he couldn't get away with his pride. He read about Marcus Williams in his small room one night while he was by himself. His attention was drawn to the guard's steadfast, calm, and quiet respect. His chest felt a pang of envy and something deeper, maybe respect. Harold looked at the screen, and Marcus's face was there. There was no sound in the room at all. Harold thought about what his life might have been like if he had chosen respect over privilege and humility over pride for the first time. He didn't know the answer, but the question kept coming back to him. When Marcus got back to London, his story continued to move people. The news talked about how calm he was under pressure, and people all over the world praised him for being an example. Marcus stayed steady, though, and wouldn't let the praise take his attention away from his work. He learned a simple but important lesson. Justice wasn't just punishing the guilty. It also meant standing strong in the face of trouble and showing that honor could win over stupidity. Marcus was getting ready to leave the palace grounds one evening when Captain Eldridge came up to him. Eldridge told Williams, "Well done," and his voice was full of praise. "You've done more than follow the Royal Guard's rules. The world has seen again what real strength looks like in you." Marcus nodded. He looked calm, but determined. "Thank you, sir. Strength isn't how hard you hit, it's how well you stand. That's what my dad always said." The world kept moving forward as Marcus walked into the London evening. His shape was strong and steady, but his story stayed with many as a lesson that honesty, bravery, and respect could lead the way, even when things looked the worst.